Hi everyone, Brian from Nerdiest Brewing here, and I've got a little bit of a secret to tell. Turns out I'm a big old nerd, and I know that's going to come as a real surprise to my longtime viewers, because certainly in none of my other videos or the environment that I shoot in would ever have given away that little secret. Well, like many people who lean towards the geeky side of things, I started way back in my teens playing a game called Dungeons and Dragons. If you don't know what that is, it's basically gambling for nerds. Well, recently, due to some certain events that led to many of us being stuck in our houses for long periods of time, D&D has had a bit of a renaissance. And with that, some people like myself who stopped playing several decades ago have come back to playing it again. And part of what led a lot of us back into the game, myself included, is this somewhat niche, not broadly watched show called Critical Role, which you'll find here on YouTube. Uh, the best way to describe Critical Role is to actually let them describe it themselves. So I'll turn it over to their host, Mac Mercer, for a second.
And welcome to tonight's episode of Critical Role, where a bunch of us nerdy-ass voice actors sit around and play Dungeons and Dragons.
And yeah, that pretty much says it all. They're professional voice actors, and they film themselves playing D&D. Personally, I mostly listen to this essentially as a podcast. I have a long commute, so it works out as a good way to burn some time. Well, I finally got around to watching Campaign 2 or Season 2 of Critical Role. And in the first few episodes, something called Trost came up many times. And again, I'll turn it back over to the Critical Role folks to sort of explain what that is.
Ordering a Trost has become common terminology in many taverns that serve the unique, sweeter ales of the settlement's breweries. Many attribute the distinctive flavour to the waters of the nearby Ustaloch, while others attribute the flavour to an enchantment on the nearby soils harkening back to the Age of Arcanum.
So there are other mentions of this beer in the first few episodes of Campaign 2, but it does kind of fade away after that point. There's also some written information on it in a playbook that they published as part of their campaign, although it really doesn't contain any information that you wouldn't listen to or hear in the videos. But as you can imagine, as someone who's been brewing for a long time, the first thing that happened in my brain when I started hearing this description of this beer was I started internally kind of mapping it towards beer styles and towards ingredients that I might use to make it. And the description of this beer sounds an awful lot like a Southern English brown. It's sweet, it's easy to drink, it's really dependent on high quality grain, which is sort of a Southern English brown. And so I started putting together a recipe to make my own version of Trost, which I could then enjoy as I watched later parts of Campaign 2. Now, of course, this is D&D. It's nerd gambling. There are dice involved. And so, of course, this wasn't as simple as just making a nice English brown recipe. We had to throw in that factor of chance into the recipe. And so what I did is I basically outlined a basic recipe for an English Southern Brown. Now, of course, this is Dungeons and Dragons, so we can't just simply come up with a recipe. We have to throw in that little bit of chance by using some dice. And so the way I made this recipe is I came up with sort of a generic Southern Brown recipe with a few tweaks to the style that I personally prefer. So for example, I really like the flavor of a small amount, 4 to 5% of brown malt in these ales. But instead of defining each ingredient specifically, I instead kind of put in ranges of what would be sort of reasonable for those different malts, on the low end being lower than you would want it, on the high end being higher than you would want it, although nothing insane, and then with the things in the middle kind of falling in more typical ranges. I then rolled dice, D&D dice, to come up with the amounts of each of those ingredients that I used. And the ingredients that I used I don't think will surprise anyone, especially if you're familiar with English-style ales. We, of course, want a high-quality base malt to build this off of, and if you're building an English ale and you need high-quality malt, there's only one thing to go to, that's Maris Otter. There's always a mixture of lighter and darker crystal malts, and so again I split between Crystal 60 and Crystal 120. I also worked in some darker malts. As I mentioned earlier, I really do like brown malt, which gives sort of a subtle, roasty, nutty flavor to things, as long as you don't use too much. I also added in some roasted malts, including some bittered roasted malts, not so much for flavor, but more to play around with the color, how dark or light it would be. So I rolled my dice, I ended up with my malt bill, and then the next step, of course, was the hop bill. And just like before, define kind of a reasonable-ish range of hops in terms of IBUs, rolled for that. I picked a couple of character hops to add as a flavor addition, so Goldings, Fuggles, Challenger, and there's one more that I'm forgetting at the moment, and I rolled a d4, so a four-sided die, to pick which one of those I used for a flavor addition, and again, rolled the dice to figure out how much I was going to add. And then, of course, the last thing is we need to worry about our yeast. And here, I took advantage of the fact that I am a big old nerd, and I kind of biased things in my favor because I wanted to make sure that I was getting a decent yeast in this. And so when you're rolling multiple dice, especially D&D style dice, where you can have dice that have anywhere from 3 or 4 sides through to 20 sides or more, is you can often have dice where the maximum possible value is the same, but where the chance of getting particular values is different. So for example, if you have a 20-sided dice numbered 1 to 20, your chance of rolling any number on that is 1 in 20, or 5%. But if you have 2 10-sided dice and you roll those, the probabilities are different. Your maximum value is still 20. Your minimum value is actually 2. You can't roll a 1 because the lowest number in both dice is a 1. And the numbers in the middle are far more likely to be rolled than are the numbers on the ends. And the reason for that is simply that on 2 10-sided dice, the number of potential rolls that add up to, say, 8 or 12 is a lot higher than the number of potential rolls that roll up to 20, right? You have to get 2 10s to get to 20, but there's 5 or 6 different ways you can get an 8. So the reason I did that, as I mentioned, is I wanted to bias my chances towards getting a good yeast. And so I put the classic English strains all kind of in the middle of the range of 2 to 20. And then I put some crazy things out near the end. I had some Kvike in there. I had some Saison yeast in there, which would have been horrible. And I even had some lager yeast. And then I rolled. And I didn't get the yeast I would have picked, but I was pretty close. So the yeast strain that I ended up selecting or choosing was reasonable selection for the style of ale. So with that, I now had a recipe, and so of course the next step is to brew it. I'm not going to belabor the brew day. It was pretty uneventful. I mean, it's an English style beer. These are very simple to make. Single infusion, mash out, sparge, boil, done. And so that obviously brings us to the beer itself. So the beer fermented quite nicely. You can see it there. And you'll notice it is a little on the dark side. The dice did not play kindly with those darker roasted malts, and I was on the high end for all of those. Likewise, the crystal malts are a little on the lower side of what I would normally prefer for this style. But that said, it's a really good beer. So it's not quite a Southern English brown. It's obviously a little too dark. Flavor-wise, the crystal malt sweetness, the crystal malt character is a little tamped down from where it should be. And there are some roasty notes, not strong roasty notes, but roasty notes that are definitely higher than what you would normally expect in that style. So like I said, it's maybe heading towards sort of a brown porter in character. But it is still a pretty good beer. Not disappointed at all. The only other flaw in this beer, and it has nothing to do with the recipe, is I wasn't paying attention when I was pulling malts out of my basket, and I grabbed a bag of really old crystal malts. And crystal malts, unfortunately, do not age well. They need to be used relatively fresh, and this stuff was probably about 3 or 4 years old. So if you've ever had a beer made with stale crystal malt, you know the flavor I'm talking about, and this has a little hint of that. Luckily, it wasn't a large portion of the total grain bill, so it didn't ruin the beer. But I think it'd be a little bit brighter and maybe a little bit sweeter if I had not used the really old crystal malt and used the new crystal malt that I had bought specifically for this beer. But it is really good. I'm really enjoying this. It's a good beer for the rainy, wet, cold spring we're having right now. It's easy drinking. There's enough there to be enjoyable, but it's not so heavy that I can't go outside and garden after a couple of these. So I thought, in addition to sharing sort of the story and the brewing of this beer with you, that I would also share not one, but actually two recipes. The first recipe is the recipe for this beer here, so the one made by Rolling Dice, which I've called Satanic Panic. And if you get that reference, you'll understand why I used it, and it makes perfect sense for what I have here. The second recipe, though, is the sort of true recipe for Trost, where I've actually generated a recipe that best matches the description from the video without worrying about rolling dice and correcting, I shouldn't say correcting, but changing some of the things that sort of push this particular beer away from what was described and away from a sort of a Southern English brown. You can find those recipes in the video description below or on my blog, which will be linked down there. And I encourage you to try them. Although with summer coming, you might want to wait till fall. These are nice, but they're not really a summery beer. They're pretty sweet and not exactly thirst quenching or lawnmower style beers. Anyways, if you made it this far, probably play Dungeons and Dragons, but thank you for joining me. And I will look forward to seeing you in a future video.